As this Muslim general was working with us to make plans for our safety, the prayer call went off. The general looked over to the sergeant who was serving tea and said, "Sergeant, you're better at this. You come up here and lead us in prayer." And then he looked over at me and said, "I know you're a Christian, but stay here and join us in prayer. You're very welcome here."
Welcome back to the Shape the World podcast, the Creative Change Economy series. As we build momentum for the Shape the World Summit 2026 in London, we're exploring how faith-based assets and holistic values can fundamentally reshape global finance. Today, I'm deeply honored to welcome Dr. Brian Grimm. Brian is the president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. More than that, Brian is a co-partner in our journey. He sits on the Global Council for the Multi-Faith Economy MARC, helping us build, together with his REDI Index, a taxonomy that will make this vision a reality. Brian, before we begin, I just want to personally thank you for your active, tireless collaboration in developing the MARC and helping us shape the upcoming London Summit.
Wonderful to be with you, and it's a privilege to go on this journey with you.
Thank you, Brian. As we already said in the first episode, at Consulus, we believe everything starts with a cause-driven leader. I had quite a few occasions to get to know the men behind the REDI Index, so I consider myself lucky. But as we have the occasion here and now, I would like you to share your personal story with our listeners. I've heard fascinating stories that you spent years as a missionary in the Soviet Union and China. How did those experiences navigating faith in highly restrictive environments shape your understanding of freedom, human flourishing, and eventually business?
As we're recording this, there's another war going on in the Middle East. I was in the United Arab Emirates and an academic coordinator at their military academy on September 11th, 2001. And so as those attacks happened, I have my family, 4 kids. I had just dropped off my daughter in Dubai. She was doing a year's internship there, and we lived out in the desert on the border of Oman at the military academy. As those attacks happened, the general called us into his office, the leadership, to work on evacuation plans. And as we sat around his table making plans, the guys from the SAS, that's the British Special Forces who did the military training, had their own plan. They were escape up into the hills because we lived in the city, Al Ain, had 20,000 Afghan citizens living there, almost all men, working as manual laborers, and they had rioted violently several years before, and so they were really concerned that there would be an uprising, and of course Americans and internationals would be the target. But as this Muslim general was working with us to make plans for our safety at a time when everybody could imagine planes flying into any building and attacks happening anywhere, the prayer call went off. The general looked over to the sergeant who was serving tea and said, "Sergeant, you're better at this. You come up here and lead us in prayer." And then he looked over at me and said, "I know you're a Christian, but stay here and join us in prayer. You're very welcome here." And that moment for me is when I began to understand the power of not just faith in the workplace, but religious freedom in the workplace. That I was recognized as a religious minority and I was being protected by the Muslim majority. I found myself, when I worked in the UAE, interested to work hard. I wrote a textbook that was based on poetry I wrote during that time. And it was very different than the experience I had just across the border in Saudi Arabia some years before, where Christianity was illegal. If I had even mentioned Merry Christmas, I would be fired. And there I couldn't wait till my contract was up. Here I was, it was a place where I could flourish. And I think that's the pivot. Having been, those missionary years were mostly as a Protestant, a Baptist, and then we became Catholic in 1994, my wife and I. Part of that, along with these kind of experiences in the UAE, helped us understand that our missionary calling was to religious freedom, You can have lots of different missionaries do all kinds of work in the world, from medical to educational to preaching to healing. And ours was really it became clear over time that it was a calling to religious freedom. And that workplace experience is really what formed the basis of the work that I do now at the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, is to help other businesses and companies understand that the culture of their workplace, if it's one where you have to hide your belief, for people for whom faith matters, they're going to be looking for somewhere else to work, and they're not going to give their all. But if you let them know that you respect, you don't have to join their faith, but you respect and honor their commitments, then that gives a much healthier workplace and a place that can be much more successful. So that same principle applies to interpersonal relationships, where we give each other the right to believe and respect each other's belief without having to agree with each other, but we can have dialogue and work together. And that's from the personal level to the business level to the economic level. And I think that's where we're going to be heading, talking about some of those bigger questions. How might some of this apply to the bigger economic questions that we face?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you were relating to or referring to the current situation, right? I mean, we see, the US, we see Israel, we see Russia, and maybe the leadership that we are experiencing is not the one that you are a little bit, presenting over here, or that you have experienced or wanted to promote. Yeah, you created a corporate religious equity, diversity, and inclusion index, which is the REDI Index, which benchmarks faith-friendly workplaces and has been adopted by major Fortune 500 companies. For our listeners who might be new to it, I would like to explore more, because about the current situation we'll speak on our next question. But how does faith-friendly workplace look like, and why and how it is a competitive advantage?
Second question, I sort of alluded to why that's a competitive advantage, and I'll explain what it looks like. But what it doesn't look like is Silicon Valley. A few years ago, a major tech company, one of the Muslim employees wanted to block an hour on his calendar to pray on Fridays. And the company said, "What in the world are you doing? That's unacceptable. You come here to work, you don't come here to pray. Pray on your own time. You can't block that's time we might need meetings, we might have, urgent business that comes up. You can't block that." And he called over to another company, Salesforce, where we'll be having some of the events in October for Dare to Overcome Summit and also the Shape the World Summit. And he called us Salesforce and he said, "I hear that you are accommodating to people of faith." And they said, "Yeah." And they said, if I would want to block my calendar on Friday for prayer, would I be allowed? And they said, "Of course you would. We do our most to help accommodate as much as we can." And the long story becomes short, because he got a job there, senior tech exec, leaving one company to join another. It's not just that company lost a person, they lost all of his knowledge, his institutional knowledge, his technical knowledge, professional relationships, to a competitor. That's why it's bad for business not to have a faith-friendly workplace. And, you can see that same story over and over. And there's many other facets to that. When you allow faith to come in, people bring their whole soul to work, not just their whole self to work. And when you bring your whole soul, then you're a little more careful about not cutting corners, about having integrity. It's not that religious people are more, have more ethics than people that aren't religious. You can be very religious and be a murderer, just for instance. And you see that, in many cartels and mafia, there can be a lot of religion overlaid and you can still be very much of a scoundrel. But when people of faith bring their real faith to work, then you have these values and additional motivation to do your best, to perform, because many people of faith see that their work is not just a way to make money, but it's a calling, it's a vocation, So Catholics often talk about vocations, and it doesn't mean just somebody who's a priest or a nun, but a vocation is your calling, what you're here on earth for. So all of those dimensions of a worker come out when they're allowed to bring their whole soul to work. But what does a faith-friendly workplace look like? It's one where you create an atmosphere like that, and that was the question we had when we created the Faith-Friendly Workplace Index, and it was we brought in Fortune 100 people from Fortune 100 companies, global companies, who were all leading faith initiatives for employees within their companies. And we asked, well, what would it look like? What would you consider success? And that's where the REDI Index came from. It was from input from people who are working in companies who said, if our workplace did these things, we feel like that would be a good benchmark. We'd say, yeah, we're on the right track. And so those things include that they're open, like their public websites indicate that they're faith-friendly. They have faith-based employee groups. They maybe provide spiritual care. That's another thing that people brought up, is that, there's a lot of anomie, or, this detachment from what's going on in the world, and people feel detached from it. That's a spiritual condition. Even the McKinsey & Company Health Institute views spiritual health as one of the 4 pillars of health. So that spiritual health is when there's meaning and purpose beyond your own self in life. That's how they define spiritual health. And, for many people, that's religion or, spirituality, but for not everyone, that higher sense. So even someone who's an atheist can have that higher sense that there's more important things than just myself. So those are some of the criteria. Do they allow these groups to work, have faith groups in the workplace? Do they provide accommodations, like for time of prayer, or many faiths have certain religious garb or symbols that people wear. Do they permit that, as long as it's not a safety hazard? Do they have a way that if someone feels like they're being discriminated against because of their faith or belief, are there mechanisms that they can report that without it being a black mark on their record? And other things, does the company itself allow their employees, whatever they might be called, partners or members, or the team, do they allow them to get professional resources that help them on this journey of a faith-friendly workplace? So can they go to conferences like the ones we'll have in London, and so forth? And then other things such as, do they honor or celebrate the holy days of all the faiths in the company? So if you're in a Christian majority country, do they recognize, Ramadan and Yom Kippur and Diwali and other holidays? And if you're in a Hindu country, are they recognizing the others that are non-Hindu? And then maybe practical things like many, especially big companies, will match employee donations to charities. And some companies have a no religion policy. Well, if it's to Caritas or World Vision, or Islamic Relief, we won't do that. But if it's to the Red Cross, you can do that. But do they match donations to faith-based charities? So those are some of the questions. And then this index itself recognizes that there's many more ways that a company could demonstrate and practice a faith-friendly atmosphere. So there's a bonus question at the end that says, is there something else you want to tell us, that we've missed in the questions, and share that. So one company, actually the one I mentioned, Salesforce, submitted a more than 100-page document of bonus material. And, and it's not the length of the pages, the number of the pages, but it was just the wide variety of things that they do that didn't necessarily fall into one of the 11 core questions.
Amazing, Brian. I mean, you touched upon a lot of things that we can, continue discussing. about, and it's fascinating how much more we can explore within a company when we also consider the faith or the inner beliefs of our employees, clients, and so on. For whoever wants to get to know more about the fascinating work Brian and his foundation is doing, that's why we shared some links in the description. We were saying before, and I think this is more of the current debate, on the current situation of the world. And we truly believe that our multi-faith economy, Mark, it is a concrete and a direct alternative to today's situation, building peace as much as possible, right? So thanks again for working together for this. And we are using your REDI Index as a foundational framework alongside the Economy of Communion's 7 impact measure to create a universal ethical taxonomy. Could you explain to our audience how exactly does the faith at work, the workplace index, link to the economy, Mark, and how it would be, a direct solution to today's situation?
So I think one thing to clarify is we're talking about a multi-faith economy, Mark, not a faith economy, Mark, not a Christian mark or a Jewish mark or a Muslim mark or a Hindu mark or a Buddhist mark or, whatever particular faith. And so by its very nature, we're saying that this is a place where all people of all faiths and economic activities, assets, financial instruments are welcome. It has to be at its very foundation open to all. So I think that's the first connection with the REDI Index, is that the REDI Index isn't an index to measure how open the workplace is to being a Muslim or a Christian or any particular faith. It's how much it's open to all and respecting all. So I think that's one of the first very important connection points, because there's been a lot of work done by especially Christians and Jews and most prominently by Muslims to develop a Sharia instruments. So defining this is what aligns with Islam. And so that those efforts go on, but then it becomes a very siloed or segmented part of the economy that doesn't bring everything in. And so I think that's what the multi-faith economy, Mark, is working towards. So that's where any faith friendly, so it could even be a company that has nothing to do with religion, but they commit themselves to both the principles that we're espousing. I don't know if that maybe you want to head in a different direction, but or probe something I've said a little bit deeper. I'll throw it back to you, Christy.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I think we need today. As you said, is not only faith-based or faith-related companies. They can be, allowing faith companies or institutions. And this is another point that I want to touch upon. And international institutions, as the London Stock Exchange, one of the institutions that we are collaborating with in order to bring forward this kind of an economy, Mark. I find it quite interesting that the motto of the London Stock Exchange is "Dictum meum pactum," my word is my bond. So when you look at the companies and institutions at the top of the REDI Index, how does their commitment to honoring the deeply held beliefs of their employees create a stronger culture of trust and governance? And how, the dialogue with this kind of companies, institutions would, build long-term value?
The REDI Index itself is focused on a workplace, the workplace culture. But some of the bigger questions come in with the economy of communion measures with where is your business heading? Why are you doing the business? Things like that. So I think the REDI Index by itself doesn't get at the heart of some of those questions. But I think maybe just one example of, a concrete example of what we're talking about, thinking of a faith-based, say, hospital. There are hospitals that are run by Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Buddhists and others. Imagine a community with no hospital. It'd be a very sick community, with a very hopeless community. It would be, it'd be, the Dark Ages, where there's no hope. Someone gets sick, and there may be no hope for them, even for common things. So when you think of an economy, if you had to have an economy, and many hospitals around the world are faith-based, what if we would remove them? The world would be so much poorer. But right now, on the London Stock Exchange or any stock exchange, you don't see that big contribution being made by faith institutions that are open to serving all people. A Catholic hospital does not just serve Catholics, and the same for the rest. They're open to serving the community. So that's a true foundational economic value that is not represented as we think about the economy. So part of this multi-faith economy, Mark, would be to say, assets such as a hospital or faith-based schools or faith-based charities that are really adding value, true value into our economy. We should be recognizing that and investing more in that, because that is what's creating our future. Whereas now, the economy, somebody has a new idea for, AI is a big thing, but it's the next big thing that's happening right now. And I just heard somebody threw $4 billion at a new AI startup. Wouldn't it be great if they say, well, these real contributions of this multi-faith economy really could use more investing as well. So, it's just like big ideas attract a lot of capital and a lot of risk. Whereas if you have faith-based institutions in a society, many of them have been there decades, if not centuries, and they plan to be there for decades, if not centuries more. How many AI startups are planning that?
We would need to create a sort of a balance between, the performance per se, in terms of financial, or even in terms of, my idea to create something, and the social impact, the value for the community that my activity, my idea will or is creating, right? So in this way, the multi-faith economy, Mark, that focuses exactly on supporting this kind of projects, businesses. It is a direct and a concrete solution for today's situation. Now we are going to conclude, and I would go back to a personal level towards you, Brian, considering, your experience, your strong experience, as we said, in restrictive regimes even. So what is your vision for today? You are doing a great job. You are an influential person. So I would, challenge you for 2-3 minutes to tell us what is your vision for today.
As many people, I forget who said this at the beginning, but it's a common saying, so much more can get done if you don't care who gets credit. So just the nature of my foundation, the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, is that we view ourselves, and I view my work as a catalyst. I'm trying to get just the right ingredient that sparks action, and others can carry it forward. So even the REDI Index itself is not, it's not a product that we do and try to sell as a product, but it's a way to get companies to say, yes, we're going to do this, and we're going to commit to doing it. And now they're doing the work, not me, right? So the people in the companies that are creating this kind of atmosphere are the ones getting the credit, and that's what the REDI Index recognizes, and then we give awards. So I think it's very important to have a humble attitude, and an attitude that you're here to serve, to not be served, and to try to do what you can within your sphere of influence to help to challenge others. You're challenging me. Okay, what are you going to do? And I'll just turn that back. That's what I do, is I try to challenge others to get involved, to view the world in different ways, to take action. So that's what my hope is, that the different initiatives that I'm involved with become a lever. And with a lever you can move a big object if you get the fulcrum right. If you get it right here, then you can have a little energy, but you can do a massive amount of work. So that's what I think everyone and everything we do has the potential to do. But of course that's risky, because then you're saying I'm not in control. I'm just trying to spark action. And then if you're not trying to own what the results are in totality, but you're trying to create something new, so much more can be done. So that's my hope. That's the dream from the work that I do. I don't create something for me, but it's something that others pick up and they say, this is mine. CEO founder who'll be with us at Dare to Overcome and Shape the World Summit is Don Larson, who's the CEO of Sunshine Nuts. He was a vice president with a very large food corporation in the U.S., the Hershey Food Corporation, that makes things like Reese's peanut butter cups and Hershey chocolate bars and other products. But he was their vice president for procurement, and found himself in Mozambique. And here he found this society that used to have a flourishing cashew nut business that was basically wiped out during the Civil War. And the Civil War pitted communists against people of faith and faith groups against one another in a very messy, destructive, costly Civil War. And he just felt God calling him to go there and help them restart their cashew business. So he set up Sunshine Nuts more than a decade ago, moved his family there, sold their house in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And the principle was that 90% of the profits go back to the people of Mozambique, and that all of the value is created in Mozambique, and not just getting the raw cashew nuts and shipping them to America for processing, so to speak. So as an example, so and his principle, he works with Muslim, Christian, and other Muslims or Christians are the two main faith groups there. And he gets local farmers to help them own their own land and own their own cashew trees so that they can be the owners. And then at a fair price, he buys their cashews, and then in their factory, they roast them, package them at FDA standards, and then ship them as a finished product to the US and to the world. Some airlines in Europe are now carrying the product. Most of the major food stores in America carry Sunshine Nuts, cashews of different varieties. And then in addition to how he empowers the farmers, more than 10,000 people are now making a living from this. All the people who work in the headquarters are people of different faiths, but they also are, many of them are orphans or widows from the war. And then he's also set up what he calls sunshine houses for widows and orphans. So some widows and maybe some orphans, and they start raising those orphans as their own. So these houses bring back life to people who lost all of their livelihood. Both they have jobs, but then they are also empowering people in very practical ways. So I think, that's a great example of the kind of initiative, and they're making all they need is investment, and they can scale this up even globally to other countries. But who's going to invest in Mozambique? And that's the question. That's what this multi-faith mark is all about, is saying, no, that is investable. There's higher risk in that society, but look at the potential payoff if we can scale this up as a true model for not just that business, but for an economy. For that, it's one of the companies looking to participate in the REDI Index for the first time. It's a global PR firm called BNP Paribas.
That's powerful, and it brings exactly two very important elements. First of all, ourselves, each one of us, that has to find inside, that that cause that he or she was born for, and the realization that we cannot do it alone. As you said, we give it for the others, and our core group of friends, group of partners, together with them, we are bringing, realizing what we are meant for, empowering through that the others. Thank you, Brian, for sharing your incredible journey and for your ongoing partnership in building the multi-faith economy mark. For our listeners, Brian's work with the REDI Index is proving that ethics and faith are not constraints, but measurable sources of value and concrete and direct impact. Join us next month as we continue our road to the Shape the World Summit 2026 in London. Until then, keep shaping a better world.